Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Well, thanks for coming again. I see a lot of familiar faces, and when Kaylin came in, she said, is anyone going to come to this? And I noticed Kaylin's been here before. This is her third time, and I know you all remember her. She's one of the nicest persons I ever met. She did the book about Maureen Dowd, if you remember, Are Men Necessary, a couple years ago, and then she did the book about obituaries last year, I think that was.
Yeah.
And today she's going to talk about, well, I'll just tell you a little bit about her first. She teaches down at St. Rose, journalism and communications. She's worked for every newspaper in the area, probably more than one, some of them. And the book is called, today she's going to talk about Nothing to be Frightened of. It's a little bit of everything. It's a book about the writing life, part memoir, part family history, part meditation on death. And so here's Kaylin Brown again to tell us about it. I'll put this down a little. See, they remembered you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out on this freezing day. This is amazing that anyone's here. It's so cold. God love you. All right, I have to find a spot for my water. Happy New Year. Part memoir, part family history. Joe's right about all that. What Julian Barnes spends most of his time doing, though, is talking about death. So here I am again.
Well, you did obituaries.
Here I am again, talking about a cheery subject in the dead of January. Yeah? I read it twice because I feel dutiful and that this is something I need to do. I read it once as a pure library reader, where you run through the books, the stacks, see what's interesting, or maybe you read a review, just pick it up and read it. I try to read it just as a reader, because that's how most people are reading books, just for some leisure, relaxing activity. And then when I go back, I put the prism on it and, word by word, deconstruct what he's saying and think about how things fit together or don't fit together. So you're getting a compilation of both of those things. My leisurely read of Julian Barnes' Nothing to be Frightened of, and then my close, positively critical read. I really try to be very positive in my criticism because it is too easy to be a critic. It's very easy to criticize anything, couldn't we all? So this is my take on Julian Barnes, and I'll look forward very much to your thoughts on him and to your ideas about this book and the subject he talked about. Nothing to be Frightened of by Julian Barnes was published just in 2008, and I start with my visit here. Tackling a memoir about death is tough enough, but when a conversation this somber is rooted in upstate New York in the bitter cold of January, author Julian Barnes might recognize some poetic irony in the circumstance of this review. Today we are here to consider a novelist's nonfiction struggle with his humanity, with his family, with or without God, and with his assessment of where we all are headed. His book title, Nothing to be Frightened of, is carefully chosen since for Barnes, the idea of nothing is in itself so fraught with meaning. Barnes spent perhaps 3 years writing this book and is now in his early 60s. He measures this stage now in his life by how long his parents lived and what their longevity ultimately says about his future. My parent lived this long, so I'm probably going to live about this long too. Or not. Will he live as long as they lived? And most importantly for him, will he die as they died, infirmed and in hospital? He has no expectation of an afterlife, though he spends a good chunk of his time contemplating what that might mean and whether he might be better off if he had some belief system similar to those who depend so heavily on what comes next. When I read Barnes's admission that he thinks about death once daily, I had two reactions, neither of them particularly insightful or philosophical, but thoughts that helped me consider our author's perspective. The first was me stereotyping Barnes, that he could name the number of times a day he thought about one topic, quantifying death thoughts the same way men have been studied on daily sex thoughts, and second, that he would take time every day to think about death. What a waste, I thought. Until I took a moment for critical self-reflection. Ah, yes, that's right. Every day I read the obituaries. First thing. It's still dark out, and I'm headed for that computer because Joe and I just had this conversation reading the hard copy version of the newspaper or online. I have taken the newspaper now as a crutch. I go online because I do all my work and read the newspaper simultaneously, the multitasking. So I'm doing this every day, and I'm looking at Barnes and thinking, what's wrong with him that he's thinking about death every day? But do you consciously think about it? When I'm thinking about obituaries, I'm not thinking death. Death is looming. It's around me. That's not how I'm thinking about death. For me, it's just an everyday occurrence, like brushing your teeth. You wake up and you read your obituaries. That's not what Barnes is doing when he's talking about death. In fact, I have some pacts with friends of mine to keep them posted so no funerals or wakes are missed. Just as recently as last week, I said, did you make it to so-and-so's wake? My friend Kate said, no, I didn't make it. I didn't know. I forgot to read. I said, I'm so sorry. I would have told you. So now she and I, in addition to some other people, promised to keep each other in tune. For some reason, I read Barnes and tisk his hyper-attention to death. But somehow his attention is not my attention, which is partially his point. In addressing the way he thinks about death, he makes his journey a singular look into why he thinks the way he does. And he spends considerable energy contemplating the lives of great composers, artists, philosophers, and writers who spent some of their time confronting the end. God or no God occupies a good percentage of his early chapters. Barnes takes time to address for the reader the many ways he has come to conclusions about the absence of a higher power. His parents were agnostic and atheist, so for him no seed was planted and no curiosity piqued to set him out on his own in a religious direction. But he counts many believers among his friends and associates, and over the years has plied them on their beliefs. He extols the works of philosophers, writers, and artists from Pascal to Aristotle to Maugham and to French writer Jules Renard, who has attracted considerable attention from Barnes. He chooses to compartmentalize people according to how and if they fear death. His list reads this way. It's a 4-part list. Try to put yourself in this place. Do I fit into one of these categories? There are four categories. There are those who do not fear death and have faith. There are those who do not fear death and have no faith. Those who have faith and fear death, and those who fear death and have no faith. You find your hole? Do you find where you fit? Okay.
You need more than one?
Oh, I don't. We could ask the author. I'm sure he does have a website. I checked it. And he has a very young picture on his cover page, which is different from what he looks like on his book. So what does that say about the man who's frightened of death? Well, we can wonder about that too. Okay. So he wonders about each of these groups in these separate categories, and he judges these people based on their category. The faithful, for Barnes, seem like some kind of anomaly. Lack of evidence prohibits him from any affirmation of the possibility of an afterlife. It strikes him as an oddity that otherwise thinking people would put any stock in what comes after annihilation or obliteration, as he variously labels death. You do not just die with Barnes, you are annihilated or obliterated when you die. Ultimately, why can't an atheist's sense of wonder at the world be equal to that of a believer's, he wonders? And mightn't there be a way to measure such wonder? He also wonders. Can't we wonder about the wondering? Okay. He is a philosopher, though he claims it is not he, but it's his brother who is the family philosopher. And here comes his brother now. A good bit of the book is spent juxtaposing himself against his brother, an Aristotelian philosopher whom he characterizes as having a much more detached view of his own eventual demise than does Barnes. Barnes, who is deeply troubled by his own looming death. During his assessment of he and his brother, I sensed a therapeutic undertaking for Barnes, who needs to name the differences and try to make sense out of why he himself is so afraid of death and his brother is not. It doesn't go back to whom was breastfed and who was bottle fed, though. He interrogates all this. In fact, he decides that they are just made that way. My brother's this way, I'm this way. I'm afraid of death, he's not. English humor sprouts up now and again in nothing when, for instance, Barnes proposes for humanity a second chance. Why can't we just have a do-over? A chance to live life again, the way comic Bill Murray did in the 1993 film Groundhog Day. Do you remember Groundhog Day? Just that he keeps waking up and it's the same day, and he can do it over and over again. And he exploits that fact. Barnes yearns for another chance to get life right, and these types of utterances have earned him the accolades of the critics, including Garrison Keillor, who recognizes Barnes' appreciation for irony and also his frustration with his topic. The book is a lamentation, too, about not having the resources to deal with the coming of death. Believers have resources, but what do non-believers have, he asks. He even looks to the act of writing and is almost self-deprecating when he states that his treatise on death is not a therapeutic effort to come to terms with his own death. But in his denial, even the most casual of reader-writers recognizes that his decision to take up this topic, one that has long been on his mind, does do something for him. He may not call writing about his fear of death therapeutic because it doesn't stave off death, but in fact, the act of writing, the naming of the problem, is known to provide some solace to the namer. At the halfway point, he talks about imagining his own dying and what that might be, and whether he might succeed at death, like a chief executive officer he had studied, or whether he will be prepared to die. He labors over the specifics of death, looking naturally, I guess, to the deaths of his mother and his father. He's quietly incensed at the way his parents died, his father and his mother each robbed, little by little, of their physical and mental faculties. He seems almost disgusted by the nature of those deaths. He is critical of what he sees in some instances as a slow, painful, dehumanizing reality of dying. Perhaps his incredulity, though, has to do with the infrequency with which he has indeed experienced death. He has seen 2 dead bodies. He talks about how sad it is to see an empty graveyard and all that the plight of an unvisited grave signifies. But his only graveyard visits are to the burial grounds of those artists, philosophers, and writers he admires and uses to shore up his argument about death. For whom is an unvisited grave so sad? If he doesn't believe in an afterlife, then who is diminished by the lack of a visit? Who loses? I don't know. Maybe it would benefit him to get more familiar with death, up close. He revisits some anecdotal evidence from his early years when he feared flying. While waiting for a plane, he watched at the Athens airport as flight after flight landed safely. And then he learned that he too would likely meet the same result when it was his turn to fly. My intent is not to equate the safe part of landing with how death might turn out. Surely I cannot speak to that. But the more time one spends with dying people and the more death is figured into daily living, not foregrounded, but not hidden either, the less befuddled Barnes might feel. The movement of the book takes us from his assessment of religion and family relationships into a look at how his life will have mattered. It seems that it is one of the ultimate problems he confronts. Will it matter? He finds it almost tragic that the chance of forgetting parts of our lives is inevitable. He points to examples of the great musicians who wrote beautiful symphonies and operas, and then in their final days failed to recognize their own musical compositions. What if he didn't recognize some passage he had written? What then? Well, from personal experience, I can say I remember a small percentage of what I have written, a small, and most likely it wasn't memorable in the first place. But either way, it seems sad to worry over whether you remember your contributions. But then Barnes has a temperament that is in tune with Edith Wharton's characterization of life as a true tragedy. Life is a true tragedy. Barnes resonates with that. And he can be identified with Shostakovich, who he looks to repeatedly throughout his book, when he calls Shostakovich the great brooder on death. Might I assert that Julian Barnes, the second great brooder on death, he does. This is a brooding book. In summoning dead artists throughout his book, there are a couple of things we learn about Barnes. He has an extensive knowledge of the arts, extensive, and he's very well versed. But like so many others, he continues to breathe life into these great thinkers just by summoning their memories up again. And I think he hopes the same thing for himself. That's what he's hoping. That's what I think he's hoping. He several times refers to the idea of those of us who simply want to say, I was here too. And this is where I think it's so poignant, because it's late in the book when he says people just want to say, I was here too, and they want to be remembered. If you haven't seen the cover of the book, what does that scream out at you? I was here too. I mean, to me, I kept going back to this every time I picked it up. To do that, to put your face on the cover of a book like that, I think that is a monumental decision. And to me, it took a long time to get to the nut of why that was. But that's my read on it. If you've read it, you'll tell me differently, or read it and then tell me differently. To me, this is what Barnes leaves us with. He said his piece, and in doing so, he reconciled some of his demons, and we now know how much he thinks about the end, and that after the end, he wants to be thought of. He even imagines another death he will endure when his cursed last reader fails to recommend his writing to another. He goes on about that too. Perhaps for an author, this then is the final death toll, when no one else will read him. Shall I put the nail in the coffin? I do have one final note, not about Barnes. That's it on Barnes. But since I had been at the library here, Joe had invited me to do Maureen Dowd a long time ago, and he reminded me I was in a room full of Maureen Dowd fans. And I gave Maureen Dowd a hard time on her book. I've come around on her. So for me, Maureen Dowd has been resurrected. So I've taken a fresh look at an author I initially had not a lot of love for, the particular book I read, but she's been writing some work lately I think is worth, authors are worth revisiting. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions about the book?
Anything about Barnes? Yes?
His wife died in '08, I believe. Do we know anything about his reaction to that?
I do not. I'm sorry, I don't, because she wasn't dead when he wrote this.
Oh, good point. Good point. I just, meant if anything had come out that he said or not said.
I don't know. I didn't see any of that on his website as recently as yesterday, though. But then I don't know that that's been updated lately.
Maybe not.
Yeah. I'm interested. Do you know how she died?
I don't.
Okay.
That's what I was hoping to ask you.
Yes.
I was mainly interested in if you knew what his reaction was.
No, but now that's the next thing I'm going to want to find out. Joe?
Does he find some solace in the fact that he is an artist and people will be reading his books?
I think he does. I think he enjoys the fact that he's a writer. He finds a lot of strength in being a writer because he gets to share ideas. So I get this sense that just writing about writing makes him feel good.
I mean, he's a pretty popular writer.
Yes, especially his fiction. Yeah, and now I'm really interested in reading his wife's obituary. Because if he wrote it...
You can tell us, please.
Well, if he wrote it, what does it say and how did he say it? That would be nice to know. Did I see another hand? Hi.
Does he mention John Gunther, who wrote maybe 30 years ago, a memoir that he called Death Be Not Proud?
No, he does not. No, he doesn't. I don't remember reading that anyway. I don't remember any reference to Death Be Not Proud. I'll say no, with reservation, but I don't remember seeing that at all.
It was written after the author lost his 17-year-old son to brain cancer. And the pain was so overwhelming that he sat down and wrote this memoir. I think it was in 1975, so it's over 30 years ago. And that title has always stood in my memory box. All these years, I didn't read the memoir, but I hoped that this author mentioned it.
I'll go back, but I don't remember seeing that. He goes back far to a lot of the classics, you know, in the late 17th century. He's looking back at Aristotle and a lot of the great French writers, actually. He puts a lot of weight with the French writers. But I do know the book you're speaking of. So I think it would have caught my mind if he had mentioned that.
What was the book we did in here?
Death Be Not Proud.
And who wrote it?
John Gunther.
Gunther. Anyone else? Yes, sir. And then
On Maureen Dowd, you say you read her. I know who she is and whatnot. I'm not familiar with any of her novels, if it is novels that she writes. Do you read her columns more than her books?
I had read her columns until the book Are Men Necessary was published, and that was the first book of hers I had read, though she's written others. But that's a work of nonfiction. Imagine that. And
She doesn't know anything about us anyway.
She has just published a profile of Tina Fey in Vanity Fair magazine. And unlike me, I read the entire profile without reading the author's name. I always read the byline, and for some reason it was insignificant the way it was positioned, and I didn't see it. And I enjoyed the profile enough that I shared it with my students because I thought they could learn something about how to put together a piece of writing in that format. And then I went back to look at it, and I saw it was Maureen Dowd, and I was beside myself that it was she who had written it, because it was a very upbeat and positive treatise on Tina Fey. Now, that could be political. Perhaps it's the fact she was a woman. I don't know. And then very recently in one of her columns, she wrote about Caroline Kennedy. And again, I was surprised at her lack of vitriol. She is usually acerbic. And that's what had kept me away from her. But she's the last several things I've read of Maureen's, I don't know if age is softening her, but that's how I feel. I feel as I'm reading, I'll give her another chance because she's not upsetting me. Sir.
I saw this book in the library and was very interested in what the cover and everything was telling me about it. And then I started reading it, and it took so long for him to get into the meat of the subject for me that I lost interest almost immediately, and I put it aside. And I just want to thank you for resurrecting my interest in this book, because I am one of those people, a secular humanist who doesn't believe in an afterlife, and I think there's probably a lot in here that I would agree with. So I thank you again. It's been very enlightening.
Thank you for your response. That was my initial response too, frankly. It's not a continuum. He's not working on a linear pattern here. His writing reads to me like hypertext, where he takes one idea and goes in a different direction, and if you had a button where you could click that underlined, underscored part on your web page, you would go to his ideas about his brother. And while he's writing about death, to me, as the main framework, you could then, when he gets over to talk about his parents or how much he hates his mother, you could click on mother and find out all the reasons he hates his mother. So he does move in a lot of different directions. He's not a linear writer, and that can make it difficult to keep with it. I would probably take this in small doses. It is dense. It's a dense, dense book.
Well, I also belong to a book club that is connected to Unitarians, which is a philosophy book club. So this book will be very interesting because you know, we like those kind of things to read.
I'd be interested to find out how your club thinks of him as a philosopher, because he's forever talking about the fact he doesn't see himself as a philosopher.
I don't think they would read him because he's not known as a philosopher.
And he talks about his brother who makes his living that way. But in reading him, I don't see much of a difference between Barnes and his brother in terms of, I haven't read his brother, but just the way he characterizes him. I would call him a philosopher on death, for sure. And perhaps that's something he wants to be known as.
Well, we always argue about the afterlife, so it probably would be a good book for our group to read, but I think we've almost had it too much.
Well, this is what happened to me while I was reading Barnes. I had this revelation about Maureen Dowd while reading Barnes, that she has found the afterlife and the current life, you know, that this is her second life. So this is all clashing. Yes?
He's not easy to read, though. I mean, I haven't read a lot of his things, but I read one I remember some years ago, and I don't recall what was the title. He's not an easy read. At least I don't find him so.
No,
And
and
the
not,
limited amount I've read.
right, and not all of his references will be familiar to all readers, including me.
Right.
And so then you have to go and look up what he's referring to or gloss over it, your decision. And it's a scholarly piece of work as well.
I was going to say, he's not writing for the masses. Do you think?
Select group of masses.
I do think he's writing for people who think about death.
Okay. Lots of people must do that, right? Yes. We don't know.
Yeah, well, right. I don't know. Behind you. Yes.
Did he, if he didn't reference Death Be Not Proud, did he talk about Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl?
No, he didn't. And both of these books I had to read in my college, so I went to a Jesuit school, so that's why I read Death Be Not Proud and Man's Search for Meaning, and they weren't referenced in here.
Yeah, because that
No.
seems like it would go along with, you know, whether he wanted his writings remembered or whatever, just the whole idea of connecting with other people.
He makes a lot of connections, but he's very much interested in a lot of the French authors and artists, and from a long time ago. He's a romantic, I would say, too. Interestingly, yeah, because he's not afraid to bare his soul about, this is making me crazy that I don't want to die. But he doesn't come right out and say it that way, but that's what he's saying. I don't want to die. Damn it. And you think, well, I think a lot of people could say that, I think, and for the numbers of people wandering around still. You know, it's a very personal subject, isn't it?
Anyone else have a question? Or, no? Well, thanks for coming again, Kaylin. We'll sure
Thank you all.
have
Thank you
back
for your
again.
questions.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.